welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm BRONWYN Nielsen. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the business and investment opportunities in Tanzania.
Tanzania covers 948,000 square kilometers and is home to 43 million people, with its capital city of Dar es Salaam. Like many African countries, it's reliant on agriculture, which accounts for more than 25% of GDP, 85% of its exports, and employs 80% of the country's workers. It has vast natural resources, and Tanzania is the only country in the world where the precious gemstone Tanzanite is found. After South Africa and Ghana, the country is also the third largest producer of gold on the continent, which it exports to China, India, and Japan. Import partners include South Africa, India, and China, from which consumer goods, machinery, and equipment is imported. Although Tanzania ranks among the world's poorest countries, the country has averaged around a 7% GDP growth rate per year between 2000 and 2008, on the back of strong gold production and tourism. High inflation driven by rising food and fuel prices, coupled with chronic energy shortages, dampened Tanzania's economic growth in 2011. The World Bank, however, predicts a GDP growth rate for 2012 and 2013 will reach 7%. Then there are discoveries of offshore gas deposits, which are now estimated at more than 10 trillion cubic feet. This is expected to boost domestic growth in the medium term. But Tanzania's tax incentives and exemptions to the mining companies and firms operating the export processing zones have lost revenue as much as $288 million between 2008 and 2011, according to a recent report. And while there is excitement about further gas exploration, some citizens still remain skeptical as to whether the ordinary Tanzanian will also reap the benefits.
Well, joining me in studio to take a closer look at Tanzania as a business and investment destination is Nick Matthews, Director Advisory and Head Mergers and Acquisitions at KPMG. Scott Nelson, HOD, ENS Africa. Also joining us from our bureau in Nairobi is SANDEEP KHAPRE. He's the CEO of BDO East Africa. Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. Just coming off the back of our introduction, Tanzania is, in terms of the East African community, and Nick, perhaps I throw this to you, if you look at the 5 countries that make up that bloc, in terms of the ease of doing business, Tanzania ranks 4th. So it's not highly regarded in terms of that East African community when it comes to the ease of doing business. What is the biggest problem that we're facing in that respect?
Look, what you need to appreciate, Bronwyn, is that Tanzania has come from a socialist background. So between 1967 Arusha Declaration and right up until the early 1990s, it was a socialist state. And that has obviously impacted on the structures and the way of doing business. So that historical legacy will certainly take some time to overcome in terms of getting institutions in place and practices and policies which make business easy. So I think, in fact, Tanzania has come a long way, but clearly it'll be some way off, in particular Kenya, which has got a long history of let's say, a capitalist business model.
Do you find that it is starting to learn from other experiences within the East African community and deploy those learnings in territory? Scott?
Yeah, I think there's a learning curve, as we've just discussed, and that there are lessons to be learned from some of the neighbouring countries who've had perhaps more radical experiences. Rwanda, for example, is a good example of somewhere which has had to come from atrocity to success in a short period of time, has not been so reliant or had the access to mineral wealth that other countries have, and has therefore had to go sort of out of its way to make an accommodating environment for business and create an attractive environment purely from the level of regulation and the ease of doing business in that country.
Sandeep, let's throw it to you in Nairobi. How do you feel about Tanzania sitting in Kenya at the moment, and what is happening on the ground in terms of leveraging business through the East African community and into Tanzania?
I think Tanzania has a great opportunity to access the East African community market. In fact, there's an unfounded fear that Kenya might, if they remove the non-tariff barriers, Kenya might become the only sole provider of manufactured goods, but that should not really be the point of view from Tanzania's standpoint. if you really look at what's happening, the cost of production in Tanzania can be substantially lower once Songo and all the energy projects come on stream properly, and the cost of electricity goes down from 20 cents per kilowatt hour to 10 cents per kilowatt hour, that kind of efficiency. And then the geographical structure of Tanzania makes it extremely easy for them to transport goods to Eastern Congo, that's outside the EAC, Rwanda, Burundi, and Zambia as well. So I think if Tanzania really gets its house in order, and as rightly put by the previous speaker, that it's come from a socialist background, it's made a lot of strides, and going forward, there's going to be a lot more activity in Tanzania as we see it.
In terms of economic activity, gold and tourism leading the way. Do you think that will continue to be the status quo going forward, especially with the gas discoveries?
Yeah, I certainly see that continuing. In terms of the current projects underway, Barrick have got a lot of new projects which are being developed, gold mines in particular. Uranium is another mining area, and diamonds. So, unlike South Africa, it's a fairly young gold mining industry. And of course, the prospects in terms of natural gas, which are being discovered offshore, are another factor. So natural resources will certainly continue to drive growth. But I also believe, as with many other African countries, BRONWYN, and I've mentioned to you it before, the consumer-facing industries also have huge prospects. I mean, approximately 45% of the population is under the age of 14. Approximately 75% of the population is rural. But the combination of urbanization, growth in income, and the demographic dividend of these young consumers emerging, I think create huge opportunities for the consumer-facing industries, retail, FMCG, financial services, and the like.
Who's taking opportunity here in the consumer-facing industries in terms of companies coming in and saying, we want to own this space, Scott?
Well, I think it's a very important East African economy, and people are building consumer-facing businesses not really country by country, but rather on a platform basis, so that they can sort of generate a platform to grow and scale their business across the continent. So we've seen it across everything from the telco sector to the retail sector to things that underpin the consumer-based economy, and Tanzania remains an important component if you're building a strategy, a consumer-based strategy in an African context.
Sandeep, in terms of conversation on the ground, is everyone very excited about the gas discoveries that we've seen of late?
Yes, there's a lot of excitement on the natural resources side, and of course the government, apart from the natural resources area, is looking at improving conditions so that manufacturing sector, retail sector can grow to target the growing middle class and the urban population, as well as targeting the neighboring countries, as I mentioned earlier.
I want to focus a little on the challenges that are specific to Tanzania. From an infrastructure perspective, how developed is the territory?
Look, they're huge challenges, BRONWYN. Power in particular is a major challenge. I think a lot is being done in that space, but there needs to be further investment. And as your news clip indicated, the lack of power does constrain especially the manufacturing industry, but the broader business community. So that is the one key constraint. Clearly, skills development remains an issue. The quality of the education is improving, but is still needs further work. So I would say skills and power are some of the major constraints, and then just general infrastructure, roads and transport remain issues.
Power is something that we highlight in every conversation that we have with regard to Africa, but these regional power pools, are they going to bring forward dividends in that respect going forward? Do you think that Tanzania will benefit specifically?
I think that the challenges facing Tanzania are not that different from the challenges facing a number of the bordering countries and countries in that area. I mean, the power remains a problem. I think there have been some improvements. I think that what's been done should generate some real difference. The infrastructure side, again, we've sort of said this and we say it over and over again, it's a challenge, and it's
and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
No, and everyone always says it's amazing you can generate 7% GDP with infrastructure and power and road and rail in the state that it's in. So that's a sort of general African comment that what has been achieved with what's available is truly remarkable. Imagine what could be achieved if the proper tools to run a developed economy were available. I think the other one that is, again, a general African comment, but I mean, has reared its head in a Tanzanian context quite a lot recently, is this general confidence in organs of the state. And that sort of whole issue.
You mean
of
political stability?
Political stability and dependability of the key institutions in the country. I mean, from a legal perspective, that is often one of the key drivers of inbound investment into a country, is having that confidence that the institutions who are there to underpin the growth and the safety of your investment are functional as they should be. And I think it's an African issue, but it's something which certainly gets mentioned in the Tanzanian context relatively frequently.
Well, there we go, Sandeep. Scott, obviously mentioning political stability, I'm going to go straight for the jugular and say, how often do you have to deal with potential corruption when you are transacting in Tanzania?
Well, we've heard from a lot of our clients that there are issues around corruption. But again, going back to infrastructure issues, I mean, there are significant advantages in Tanzania. You have a large gas find, so there can be electricity generated not only for Tanzania's use, but for export purposes. You have hydroelectricity, you have thermal power, so there should be enough electricity for actual exports. As far as transport is concerned, if they get their port issues sorted out, and the Tanzania Railways Corporation and Tazara Railways sorted out, you can have intermodal transport, and Dar es Salaam can quickly replace Mombasa as the major port for East African region. So there can be tremendous opportunities that we see in Tanzania. There is some excitement, there are some new investments getting into that area, and people are looking at lake transport to add on to the railway transport, thereby reducing costs. So if the investments come in, the costs go down, Tanzania suddenly becomes quite an attractive investment destination for a lot of people.
Another challenge, Nick, that's been highlighted over and over again is, or are rather, the shallow capital markets that Tanzania faces. And I think that's possibly being exacerbated by the current volatility and uncertainty in the global environment.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the only route for Tanzania is foreign direct investment, and there has been some reasonable flows in that regard. The capital markets are I won't say non-existent, but virtually. The stock exchange in Dar es Salaam has only a few listed counters, and liquidity is very thin. So I think raising capital in Tanzania is not really a meaningful option, and serious investors will have to come with their own checkbooks. Do
you think that the policymakers, as you put it earlier, understand the urgency with which they need to help with the transacting in Tanzania to attract that FDI rather than to scare investors off?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that generally people have figured out that the proper handling of corruption and the creating a stable environment is the only way you're going to really drive proper investment into the country. People always say, especially in a kind of a developed market context, when investors are looking at putting money into Africa, they say, well, how do you deal with corruption? Well, you deal with corruption by one, knowing what it is and sorting it out. You just can't invest in a corrupt environment. And funds who are ethically compliant and have covenants who obviously require them to sort of not invest in those kind of environments. And obviously the legislation in the US and the UK creates those problems and challenges. You simply can't go there. So the governments and the regulators in many countries, Tanzania in particular, I think are extremely attuned to the fact, not least given the lack of any meaningful capital market in which to raise capital, that FDI is the way they have to go. And if they go in and want the investment to flow, they need to have an environment where it's the people are comfortable to flow money into the country.
We're going for a quick commercial break. More on Invest Africa and Tanzania when we return. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Invest Africa. A recent visit to the British Gas headquarters in the UK by Tanzanian President Jakaya Kikwete revealed that the British multinational oil and gas company BG Group has so far achieved a 100% success rate in gas exploration in the Tanzanian basin. This has been encouraging in highlighting the country's potential as an investment destination.
Tanzania is fast becoming an investment hotspot.
Private equity, infrastructure investment, and property will be the kinds of investment areas in which we're going to be looking at. The area which is signaling potential growth is the construction area, where the country is growing, the country is recapitalizing in a number of areas.
The Tanzanian Ministry of Energy and Minerals has devised a plan to help keep the lights on and investors interested. Should this plan be successful, the country could see a 65% increase in its energy capacity, all within a period of 12 months. But the cost? $320 million. The financial viability of private power projects has come under scrutiny. The low electricity tariffs have made construction of large power plants unprofitable. This was the case with TANESCO's operating loss of $18 million in 2010. But there is a success story. Given that natural gas makes up 35% of power pumped into the national grid, Songas, a power generation company, has leveraged the country's resources and is providing clean energy. But using these technologies will need further investment into the country's workforce.
You look at the human capital capability of our nations from the human pool that we create and the importance of continuing to invest in our people in order to ensure that we create environments that can grow sustainably.
Although Tanzania is on the right path and showing that there are pockets of wealth in the country, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Dumisho Makanyele, Johannesburg.
Well, obviously, Sandeep, there more clarity on the oil and gas discoveries in territory and the excitement around that. But I want to stick with a theme that Nick highlighted earlier, and that was the Tanzanian Stock Exchange with a lack of liquidity, just a couple of listed companies. Isn't there merit and potential for an East African stock exchange? Now, we do know that the Africa board failed, and just a moment ago off air, Nick was saying national pride is what really gets in the way of making something of this nature succeed. What are your thoughts on that front?
Well, there have been a lot of attempts to get not only the stock exchange but commodity exchanges on a regional basis. Yes, there would be pooling of liquidity, there would be far greater activity in the market, and it makes a lot of sense. But there is definitely the issue of national pride. It comes back to the socialist past of Tanzania. And if there is progress in that particular area, it would definitely help in further investments in Tanzania per se.
Nick, perhaps you can give us a little bit more colour. You were seconded to Tanzania, lived in country for 3 years, if I'm right. In terms of national pride, in terms of culture, perhaps you can elaborate on what you saw and experienced on the ground.
Yeah, well, look, I had a fantastic experience in Dar es Salaam. I lived there for 3 years, and I found people very friendly and welcoming. But what I did learn in my time there is that South Africans who often come in, and a lot of the expat investors in the country, or foreign investors are South African, do sometimes come with an arrogant way about doing business, trying to impose their will and business methodologies. And the Tanzanian environment and culture is different. And I think my advice to anyone investing in the country is, to the extent that you extend expat staff into the country, make sure that they're attuned with the local culture so that they don't have that arrogant attitude which sometimes prevails in the expat community.
In terms of developing relationships in country, the best way to go, would it be a JV with nationals, with Tanzanian nationals?
In the context of any particular business sector?
Exactly, a business setting up. Do you go in greenfields and set up from the ground and experience perhaps the potential cultural misfit of putting expats in and saying, now set up a business? Or do you go the JV route, the joint venture route, and say, let's partner with a company that is existing in this territory that has like-minded businesses?
No, I think you need to go in fully integrated into any country. I think that the cultural challenges, as we said a minute ago, are, you can't assume, it applies in a global context, but particularly in an African context. You can go from Tanzania to Kenya and you're actually, you might as well be in a different world. There are very, very different approaches and cultures, although they share a border. We firmly believe that the only way to do business in Africa is to go in embracing and adopting the local cultural approach. Don't assume that your own way is the right way. And you can't run businesses, I don't think, generally Africa in particular, on an expat basis. I think you need to be fully integrated with local partners on the ground.
Sandeep is still on this theme. If we look at the differences, as Scott was saying just a moment ago, that you can't run a Tanzanian business potentially from Kenya because those differences still exist within the East African community. What do you notice as the biggest difference when dealing with Tanzanian nationals versus Kenyan nationals?
Well, as the earlier speaker said, the Tanzanians are extremely welcoming, good people, very gentle. But in terms of skills development, there's a lot to be desired as far as Tanzania is concerned. If you look at the number of accountants, the number of lawyers, good quality engineers, you have a very small percentage of the population who are in professions. So it becomes difficult to employ people and retain people for a long period of time. So there needs to be some amount of openness in Tanzania in allowing expatriates to work, especially the East African community. There has been a declaration in the East African community of free movement of labor, common standards of education. Well, that has to really take place. And then as the countries start becoming equal in terms of their education and skills levels, the productivity levels, then I certainly believe that Tanzania definitely has a greater potential than any other East African community country.
If you look at the KPMG infrastructure, you've got an office in Tanzania. How does it work for the group?
Well, we've got a very strong East African practice. Which operates as integrated within the region, and then further on than that, we run a very integrated practice across Africa. So obviously, it's very important to develop the local skills in country and in market. But clearly, in a country and economy the size of Tanzania, they're not going to have all the necessary specialist skills that are required to execute on complex engagements. So our strategy is really to operate as a Pan-African team, making sure that we deploy the right skills across borders wherever we possibly can. And unless you have that approach, I think it's difficult to be able to service your clients.
How do you view Tanzania in terms of that East African hub?
I mean, as we said a number of times, it's a big, important economy, and in an East African context, I think it would be unusual for a large professional services organisation not to be interested in that economy, in the context of a strategy of its Africa platform businesses. I think I just want to echo what Nick was saying a second ago, that the integration of offices and practices across countries, from SA to Tanzania to Kenya, wherever it may be, is really fundamental. And the transferring of skills, one of the things I think is crucial, picking up on the sort of the relative lack of skills at this stage, is a role that large firms can play in growing those skills, but growing those skills in country, so that you're building up a proper, really meaningful force of talent in the country to provide an African professional services alternative, which is not just sitting in SA, but sits across the whole continent.
Sandeep, let's throw it back to you in Nairobi. In terms of the next 5 years, how do you see Tanzania transitioning on all fronts?
Well, politically, it's likely to remain stable. We are not very sure as to how CCM or any other party would come in power or not, and that I'm not much of a political commentator on that, but the political stability and continuity of policies is almost guaranteed. In terms of BDO itself, we believe the fastest growth from an East Africa perspective would come in Tanzania. And we are seeing that. We are seeing substantial growth both in the natural resources side as well as on the services and manufacturing side. And we have been providing services to these sectors. So I strongly believe that over the next 5 to 6 years, given the global conditions, I think Tanzania would continue to grow at a fast clip at 7%. If the inflation can be brought under control, this country will do extremely well in the next 4 to 5 years.
Nick, I'm going to ask you, for any businessman out there watching this program and looking at Tanzania as a potential hotspot, given your experience in country, is there any snippet of information that you can leave us with?
Yeah, look, I think the most important thing is to visit the country, meet the people, and get involved with the local business community. I think it's not the type of investment you can make by remote control. It's important to be there on the ground and make sure you get good advice, in the local business community.
Scott, a final word of parting advice from Ines?
I think that Tanzania as a country with great opportunity. I think the subject of this debate was why is it ranked so lowly. I think we've discussed some of those reasons, but I think the positives outweigh the negatives. There are some suboptimal factors, but a lot of it's extremely positive, and particularly the way it sits with the related countries throughout the whole of the EAC. I think there's a lot to be excited about.
Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time and for sharing your valuable insights. That's all we have time for on this edition of Investor Africa. We'll be back again at the same time next week. Until then, from me, BRONWYN Nielsen, and my guests, it's goodbye.